Does the Slayer class slay as hard as its name implies? The answer is no. Let's find out what this class has to offer and see if it's any good or worth your time. At a minimum, I'll explain what is good and not so good about the Slayer class. So let's check that bad boy out right now. So the Slayer class. We are basically looking at the Warlord class, as I mentioned before in my weekly preview video where I talked about this. And this is because we've got the War Tree and the Fire Tree, both of which that the Warlord class also shares. So the only difference is really, do I care about the Death Tree versus the Morale Tree? So the Warlord class has Morale and the Slayer class has Death. And then do these traits matter? So let's look at the traits. Gaining 1 attack when an enemy casts a spell. I hate this. I hate things that trigger based on the enemy casting a spell that's like a stat bump like this, especially such a minor one. If an enemy is casting a spell, that's bad, and you gaining 1 attack as a result is like great, better than nothing, but it's like basically nothing. Like whatever spell they cast is dramatically more interesting than that 1 attack that you gained. So you can never depend on Grudge as a trait that's going to help you a ton. So this is awkward. Not a fan. Bloodlust is also kind of awkward because once you get this class up to level 70, you get access to Enrage on every single 4 or 5 match. This is a trait that's basically saying like, well, you can Enrage every time an enemy dies. And it's like, okay, well, I'm probably going to be Enraging like 17 times a fight if I'm using this class. And like 2 of those are going to be because Bloodlust was there. So admittedly, Bloodlust is kind of an awkward trait to have as well. So these first 2 are admittedly looking pretty shaky. Maybe number 3 is going to be amazing. Maybe. But it's not. So, inflicting bleed on all enemies when an enemy dies. So first off, you have to kill someone, and then when you kill somebody, now, you know, you are enraged, which you're like, oh, hell yeah, I'm enraged, and then you've bled the other 3 people, and if you kill the second person, now you've added another bleed to the bottom 2 people. The problem is that bleed is just not a good debuff. So, I mean, the damage that it does is so slow, so the damage part of bleed is not interesting. And then because they're bled, there's nothing else interesting you can really do with it. There's no classes that can do anything cool with bleed. There's no troops that can do anything cool with bleed. The only troop in the game right now that does anything meaningful with bleed would be King Bloodwood, and he creates bleed himself, and the multiple stacks of bleed are not going to help you. So the bleeding part, the damage part of bleed, not interesting. The mechanics that you can take advantage of because other troops are bleeding, also not very interesting. And if King Bloodwood does interest you, you don't need anyone else to help you bleed. He by himself creates bleed, so you don't need like a Slayer class to help King Bloodwood do more bleed. So this is also super awkward. So unfortunately right now the game has no useful bleed mechanics. This class having a bleed mechanic in its 3rd trait slot here doesn't help anything. So unfortunately the traits are kind of like bad. I'm not a fan of any of those traits. And then when we get to the talent tree, we basically have War and Fire, which is not the best. So of all of these things that are interesting, getting a passive 4 attack isn't terrible. This is fine. Chill of Death is actually pretty fun because when you kill someone and then you freeze someone else as a result, this kind of allows you to take your naturally advantaged state and push it even further, because if you start freezing people whenever you kill people, the other team is really going to struggle to try and keep up, because not only have they lost someone, but now someone else is frozen as a result if you weren't naturally freezing some other way. So at least that trait, or this talent, is pretty useful. At level 10, there's really nothing super crazy. You know, burning a random enemy when an ally dies. I hate stuff like this that depends on an ally dying. It's such an awkward condition to try and hope for, and burning someone as a result of it is also really poor. But there's really nothing else that's all that interesting either, so nothing fun at 10. At level 20, you can choose an Ice or a Firestorm. At least that can be useful, so that's not so bad. Gaining 3 attack when an enemy dies at level 40 is again super awkward. You know, depending on having to kill to gain any kind of benefit, means you're already in an advantage state. Gaining 3 attack isn't going to magically make this fight way better for you, so I find this not so great. Sealing 2 life from the first enemy on 4 or 5 matches is not awful, you know, so it's not only doing 2 damage every time you get a 4 or 5 match, but you're also gaining 2 health. So not the worst thing on the planet, but not exactly the most busted either. I would say Life Siphon is at least offering something to this class, so that's pretty cool. And then at 70, you get access to a couple cool things. So you can either become enraged on 4/5s, which I mentioned makes your existing second trait completely useless, because now you can do it on every 4/5 match, or you can get bonus red mana if you so choose. Both of these are actually fairly good options. This death marking a random enemy at the start of battle, personally, my opinion, super gimmicky. If you do this and you happen to get a kill sometimes, like, I guess good for you. But that is not something you should ever try and reliably build around. This isn't like a very useful team building mechanic. This isn't like a reliable way to kill anybody. Admittedly, I would never pick this pretty much ever. But then at level 100, you of course get access to triple skull damage. So triple skull damage when the enemy is burning is very good, especially if you can become enraged and then hit them with triple skull damage because they're burning. So obviously creating burning is very nice. And then any 4/5 match you do as a result, so pretty much any skull converter is going to create a 4/5 match for you when you cast them. So if they're burning, you become enraged, you hit that person, and now suddenly they're all in a really sad spot. You just did 3 times skull damage because they were burning, and you also did an extra 1.5 damage times damage on top of that. So you can do some fun combos to do some like really lethal skull hits. You know, so if you thought Web Spinner was bad when he hits you, just imagine someone that's doing like not only 3 times damage, but an additional 1.5 times damage on top of that in a class that's kind of scaling attack. So if you're able to create those exact conditions, you're enraged, they're burning, and you do a skull hit, you can do some pretty serious stuff, assuming they're not impervious to fire or anything like that, or have massive skull resistance. Granted, your enrage will hit through that. But this creates a very glass cannon-y kind of class. So the Warlord class, as a result, these conditions to try and set up the like other bells and whistles the class is doing, like I don't find them very interesting. This class kind of fits the same bill as the Warlord class in that capacity. However, there is something else we can do because this class is unique. So it's a Draxzoom class that is a dwarf. So this creates other opportunities for us to create some stuff. So first and foremost, there is a certain weapon called Korag's Invention. So if we look at Korag's Invention, this is creating a mana mix based on Draxzoom allies. So hopefully if we look at the Draxzoom Kingdom, we're going to see some interesting troops. What do you think? Well, the answer is actually that there is good people here. So first off, we see Fallen Valdis. We all throw up in our mouths and then we look past her. Then we look at Obsidius, who is actually one of the best mythics in the game, and we get a little happy. Then we see Glaceon. Glaceon is one of the best legendaries in the game, and arguably a lot better than most mythics. So immediately we've got 2 really good troops here, which is nice. We've got King Bloodhammer, who's actually fairly useful, so that's not so bad either. We have Moira Cragheart, also not useless, so that's pretty cool. We have a mana converter in Dwarven Zombie, which is actually pretty useful, so that's not so bad. You know, Ice Goblin is fine from a utility perspective, but we can actually create a pure team using nothing but these people and actually have an effective lineup. So if we create something that looks like this with the Korag's Invention, this class is actually not so bad. This team isn't actually so bad. So this is at least creating an opportunity where we could create this team, this lineup specifically with the Slayer class, whereas we couldn't previously with the Warlord. So it just being from Draxzoom creates more interesting opportunities. The weapon itself doesn't really do anything else of interest, so don't worry about the upgrades on this thing if this was interesting to you. The other thing of note about the class, however, is not just that it's from Draxzoom, it's that it's dwarf. So something that's wrong with the Warlord class is that the Warlord class is a giant type. The only way giants can get 50% mana start is if the Titan class is in play. So since the Warlord class is also a giant, there's no way to get the Warlord class 50% mana start. However, with the Slayer class, we can do something like that. So if we go to King Highforge in the troops menu, we can see that he gives all dwarves 50% mana start. So if I cared enough to have this be 50% mana start, I could just chuck in King Highforge. I would use a weapon that obviously doesn't worry about, you know, dwarves as much as it worries about just like anything. I would just use something like a Mountain Crusher, for instance, if I was going to run this. But now all of a sudden I have 50% mana start on my hero, and I've got 50% mana on Moira, and then, you know, of course, he himself is going to have 50% mana star. So this is immediately a much more interesting kind of a lineup than even Warlord could put together, because now we've got lots of skull smashing, we have 50% mana start. Theoretically, it has a summoner if you care about that. But this team is something that you could run on a Slayer that would be a lot more interesting than if you ran it on a Warlord, just simply because of the fact that now you can give yourself 50% mana start. So that part's also kind of fun. However, if you are trying to create the exact conditions that you need to do that burning triple skull hit thing, you're pretty much going to have to use Wrath as a skull converter that you would want to be putting on your team. So if we're using Wrath, that's going to basically put us in a situation where we're going to have to put Wrath in one of these slots. But basically, anytime you cast Wrath, if you get this class all the way up to 100, you're going to be killing whoever you hit with those skulls. So that part's kind of fun too. So overall, the class isn't the worst thing on the planet. I would rate it above the Warlord class overall. But I do think that the class is still missing anything super duper interesting to make it something I would want to reach for. Unfortunately, King Highforge is a pretty weak troop. I don't find his spell effect to be very awesome. So if you're out there interested in the Warlord class, you've been having fun with it in the past, maybe the Slayer will be interesting to you. I would say the Slayer is just a better version of the Warlord. However, if neither of that sound interesting to you, feel free to ignore it. Enjoy getting your Orb of Chaos this weekend because the new class is released, and go about your life spending money on deals online because this is the Thanksgiving weekend for everybody. But hopefully you found that interesting about the Slayer class. I'm Keylime. I will talk to you guys in a future video. I love all of you.